Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this piece of shit podcast that I'm starting today. This is the first episode of this political podcast that I'm going to be doing to the 5 people who are going to be listening to my tripe. I'm going to go over background a little bit. Name's Devontae Buford, 25 years old. This is my first podcast, first time ever doing it. This show is mainly going to be basically anti-establishment, libertarian political commentary on current events. And this is just a dry run. This is my first episode. And got a bunch of articles and a bunch of current events that I want to get to, so we're just going to dive right in. For those of you who know who I am, who are listening to this, you probably know I'm a huge fan of Glenn Greenwald, the former journalist who actually just left The Intercept, or actually he quit The Intercept, actually. He didn't get fired or anything because of editorial standards had reached a new low there. And he has a phenomenal blog out now that he does, instead of posting on The Intercept now, he does a blog. And he did I'm going to read from a portion of one of his op-eds, I guess you could call it, that he just posted about authoritarianism in the United States. It's titled, The Threat of Authoritarianism in the U.S. is very real and has nothing to do with Trump. The COVID-driven centralization of economic power and information control in the hands of a few corporate monopolies poses enduring threats to political freedom. And, there's a picture of Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg, Google CEO Sundar Pichai, Tim Cook, Amazon founder Jeff Bezos. And he just gets right into it, asserting that Donald Trump is a fascist-like dictator threatening the previously sturdy foundations of U.S. democracy has been a virtual requirement over the last 4 years to obtain entrance to cable news green rooms, sinecures as mainstream newspaper columnists, and popularity in faculty lounges. Yet it has been proven to be a preposterous farce. In 2020 alone, Trump had 2 perfectly crafted opportunities to seize authoritarian power: a global health pandemic and sprawling protests and sustained riots throughout the American cities, and yet did virtually nothing to exploit those opportunities. Actual would-be despots such as Hungary's Viktor Orban quickly seized on the virus to declare martial law, while even prior U.S. presidents, to say nothing of foreign tyrants, have used the pretext of much less civil unrest than what we saw this summer to deploy the military in the streets to pacify their own citizenry. So I kind of disagree with his take on Trump's lack of authoritarianism when it comes to law and order. I think he actually took a fairly aggressive stance on law and order during the riots here in Minneapolis and across the country. And I think, spraying protesters with gas after doing his little stunt at the church with the Bible was pretty insidious. So that's a part where I kind of disagree with Glenn Greenwald on, but a lot of what he says is true. There is a real market in driving viewers to these corporate news channels by painting Trump as this authoritarian, dangerous demagogue that needs to be stopped at all costs. And really, it really paints the mainstream media in this virtuous light, as if they're these vanguards going up against, this big bully, which, they take a grain of truth and exaggerated it for their own gain, really. That's the way I view it. But anyway, continuing. But early in the pandemic, Trump was criticized, especially by Democrats, for failing to assert the draconian powers he had, such as commandeering the means of industrial production under the Defense Production Act of 1950, invoked by Truman to force industry to produce materials needed for the Korean War. In March, the Washington Post reported that governors, Democrats in Congress, and some Senate Republicans have been urging Trump for at least a week to invoke the act, and his potential 2020 opponent Joe Biden came out in favor of it too. Yet Trump gave a variety of reasons for not doing so, rejecting demands to exploit a public health pandemic to assert extraordinary powers is not exactly what one expects from a striving dictator. A similar dynamic prevailed during the sustained protests and riots that erupted after the killing of George Floyd. While conservatives such as Senator Tom Cotton, another sleazeball right there, a Republican of Arkansas, in his controversial New York Times op-ed urged the mass deployment of the military to quell the protesters. And while Trump threatened to deploy them if governors failed to pacify the riots, Trump failed to order anything more than a few isolated symbolic gestures, such as having troops use tear gas to clear out protesters from Lafayette Park, just mentioned that, for his now notorious walk to a church, provoking harsh criticism from the right, including Fox News, for failing to use more aggressive force to restore order. Virtually every prediction expressed by those who push this doomsday narrative of Trump as a rising dictator, usually with great profit for themselves, never materialized. While Trump radically escalated bombing campaigns he inherited from Bush and Obama, he started no new wars. When his policies were declared by courts to be unconstitutional, he either revised them to comport with judicial requirements, as in the case of his Muslim ban, or withdrew them, as in the case of diverting Pentagon funds to build his border wall. No journalists were jailed for criticizing or reporting negatively on Trump, let alone killed, as was endlessly predicted and sometimes even implied. Bashing Trump was far more likely to yield best-selling books. So, this is basically what guys like on the progressive left, like Jimmy Dore, have pointed out, that there are these resistance grifters on the left who are taking full, they're really grabbing the bull by the horns when it comes to profiting off of the boogeyman known as Donald Trump. And they gin up hysteria whenever they can in order to put themselves in a better position to profit off of this. It's really become an insidious, and it's just rampant throughout mainstream media. They've made so much money off of Trump with viewership, and during the Mueller investigation, their entire Russiagate hysteria, they really, really benefited financially from these things. And I think this is what people are losing sight of. I think people have just thrown trust to their wind when it comes to the mainstream media, and it's really. I think it's more of an indictment on the people, the general public, buying into this tripe than it is the mainstream media at this point. There's always going to be vultures that are going to try and create division and scare people. But if there's a market for it to be tapped into, we really have to look inward and wonder what the hell is going on with American society. And we just are obsessed with buying into this division and buying into these narratives that we want ourselves to believe and we want to be true, and we just don't really listen to the other side, and the other side's a monster, and it just devolves into this social catastrophe that we have going on in this country where everybody hates each other. Bashing Trump was far more likely to yield best-selling books, social media stardom, and new contracts as cable news analysts. And these people are mainly narcissist journalists who just want their name in the spotlight. Social media stardom and new contracts as cable news analysts than intermittent and gulags or state reprisals. There were no Proud Boy insurrections or right-wing militias waging civil war in U.S. cities. Boastful and bizarre tweets aside, Trump's administration was far more a continuation of the U.S. political tradition than a radical departure from it. So, this is all true. When Trump came into office, he was violating all these norms, and and I'm not here to defend Donald Trump. The point is that you have to point out political hypocrisy when it's apparent. And it's been very apparent because a lot of the things that Donald Trump has done has been going on for a long time and is only being highlighted now that he's in office. Because that's what the resistance grifters crave. They want money. They totally ignored corruption under the previous two administrations. I didn't hear anybody going after Barack Obama for what he did with the freedom. He really went after the freedom of the press. And we're going to get to that. That's actually a part of this article that we're going to get to. But continuing, the hysterical Trump as despot script was all melodrama, a ploy for profits and ratings, and most of all a potent instrument to distract from the neoliberal ideology that gave rise to Trump in the first place by causing so much wreckage. Positing Trump as a grand aberration from U.S. politics and as the prime author of America's woes, rather than what he was, a perfectly predictable extension of U.S. politics and a symptom of pre-existing pathologies, enabled those who have so much blood and economic destruction on their hands not only to evade responsibility for what they did, but to rehabilitate themselves as the guardians of freedom and prosperity, and ultimately catapult themselves back into power. As of January 20th, that is exactly where they will reside. The Trump administration was by no means free of authoritarianism. His Justice Department prosecuted journalists as sources. His White House often refused basic transparency. War on terror and immigration detentions continued without due process. I think that's an important distinction to make. This isn't defending Donald Trump. This isn't a Donald Trump ass kiss fest, because trust me, on this podcast, I'm going to tear into that butthole frequently over the next month that he remains in office. But again, this is also pointing out this is a podcast that goes off after both sides here. It's really what this is about. And he, like he just says here, like Glenn says here, but this is largely because, as I wrote in a Washington Post op-ed in late 2016, the U.S. government itself is authoritarian after decades of bipartisan expansion of executive powers justified by a posture of endless war. With rare exception, the lawless and power-abusing acts over the last 4 years were ones that inhere in the U.S. government and long preceded Trump, not ones invented by him. To the extent Trump was an authoritarian, he was one in the way that all U.S. presidents have been since the War on Terror began, and more accurately, since the start of the Cold War and advent of the permanent national security state. The single most revealing episode exposing this narrative fraud was when journalists and political careerists, including former Obama aides, erupted in outrage on social media upon seeing a photo of immigrant children in cages at the border, only to discover that the photo was not from a Trump concentration camp, but an Obama-era detention facility. They were unaccompanied children, not ones separated from their families. But kids in cages are kids in cages from a moral perspective, and tellingly, the single most actually authoritarian Trump-era event is one that has been largely ignored by the U.S. media, namely the decision to prosecute Julian Assange under espionage laws. But that too is an extension of the unprecedented war on journalism unleashed by the Obama-era DOJ. And this includes a PolitiFact quote by Jake Tapper of CNN. This was on January 2nd, 2014 that he made this quote. And it was ruled true by PolitiFact because it is true. The Obama administration has used the Espionage Act to go after whistleblowers who leaked to journalists more than all previous administrations combined. The last gasp for those clinging to the Trump as dictator fantasy, which was really hope masquerading as concern, since putting yourself on the front lines. Bravely fighting domestic fascism is more exciting and self-glorifying, not to mention more profitable, than the dreary, mediocre work of railing against an ordinary and largely weak one-term president, was the hysterical warning that Trump was mounting a coup in order to stay in office. Whether Trump secretly harbored despotic ambitions is both unknowable and irrelevant. If he did, he never exhibited the slightest ability to carry them out or orchestrate a sustained commitment to executing a democracy-subverting plot. And the most powerful U.S. institutions, the intelligence community and military brass, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, and the corporate media, opposed and subverted him from the start. And some U.S. democracy, in whatever form it existed when Trump ascended to the presidency, will endure more or less unchanged once he leaves office in January 20th, 2021. I think that's a pretty good overall gestalt of where we're at in terms of the hysteria from the left about how authoritarian Trump is and what a danger he is to democracy, when truly our democracy has been in danger from the military-industrial complex and the two-party duopoly for decades. I didn't hear anybody else rail about the dangers of our democracy dying when like Glenn stated, Obama went after journalists with the Espionage Act at a rate that no other administration ever did. I didn't see anybody complain when he bombed 7 countries to hell and overthrew Libya. I didn't see really anybody complaining about the illegal CIA hacking into the Senate committee during the investigation into torture in 2014. All these things were happening. All these, and the mysterious death of Michael Hastings and on and on. All this corruption was going on and everybody was silent. But now that Trump was in office, the corporate media can profit off of using a boogeyman instead of really looking at and accurately assessing the landscape of our political corruption. They really like to nitpick and they really like a boogeyman because Trump's an easy target because he's a loudmouth and he's very unlikable. It's not as easy to go after guys like Joe Biden and Barack Obama, and that's the dilemma we're in now. The mainstream media is going to absolutely kiss the ass of this next incoming administration, and that's just a fact. But that's what I won't be doing here. So that was an excerpt from Glenn Greenwald's great article, basically just taking to task the hysteria on him. And he's a leftist. He's not a right-wing guy, but he really is taking to task his own side for their hysteria that they frequently engage in. And then also another nugget here is Joe Biden's cabinet has been getting a lot of news, and there is a Jacobin article by a journalist by the name of Sarah Lazar. Never heard of her, but I really liked her breakdown here. Joe Biden is filling his cabinet with pro-war hawks. And before I get into this, I just want to state how disturbing I think it is that the lack of media coverage, in-depth media coverage of these nominees. I mean, basically what you give is just what you get in mainstream media when you read about these selections, or just basically a skim over the top of what these people are all about. No in-depth journalism about their corruption, about their conflict of interest. You really have to go to far left, progressive, or far right sources. And these are mainstream sources, but you really have to really dig yourself to find out any sort of useful information about where these people come from and where their loyalty lies. The mainstream media will not cover it because they have a vested interest in painting the Biden administration in a certain light for some reason. I haven't quite figured it out, but I honestly think that the mainstream media establishment has a view of the world that is more cosmopolitan, is more establishment and more rooted in believing in more of an international order, and it's directly opposed to the types of nationalistic right-wing propaganda that you see on networks like Fox. And so they're naturally going to side with Joe Biden on anything, and they're going to cover his ass. But apparently this journalist refuses to do that. And she starts off, if you were hoping for a change of heart from Joe Biden after a decades-long career as a hawk, we've got bad news. His incoming team helped shape some of the most militaristic policies of the Obama administration. And it then goes in to say there was no reason to think that a Biden administration would be to the left of the Obama administration when it comes to foreign policy. Biden comes with a long political career of supporting the wars of the United States and its allies, from the 2003 invasion of Iraq to Israel's aggression against the Palestinians, which I'm not really necessarily against Israel. I'm more neutral on that, but this is just her opinion, to the protracted occupation of Afghanistan. And whatever limited overtures he made to the left during his campaign for the general election in 2020, while he simultaneously ran on distancing himself from the left, foreign policy was almost entirely omitted, as evidenced by the issue's exclusion from the Unity Task Force with Bernie Sanders. That's because the neoliberal view of the world is, when it comes to foreign policy, is completely out of touch with what Americans want. We've been in Afghanistan for 20 years. We've been in perpetual war, and people are sick of it. And so what do you do to gloss that over? What do you do to hide the fact that Not only was Obama's foreign policy a train wreck and a disaster when it came to places like Libya and Yemen, is to do the orange man bad routine, point out how evil Trump is, and really smear any opposition to your aggressive imperialist foreign policy as a Russian asset, which is what they did with women like Tulsi Gabbard, who is a war veteran. This is the low that the Democratic establishment has sunk into. They're willing to throw a war vet under the bus in order to cover up their insane foreign policy views. And then it goes on. Perhaps the most distinguishing foreign policy position Biden took on the campaign trail was his saber rattling towards China, which is totally phony, by the way. He's trying to outright wing Donald Trump on China, which was not quite as racist as Trump's. I don't know about that. But nonetheless, got so bad a Biden ad was rebuked by progressive Asian American groups for racist content. Biden eventually walked back some of the ad's rhetoric. Biden did say during his campaign that he wants to end forever wars, many of which he helped start, and that he's against the war in Yemen, a position he only took after he served in the Obama administration that supported the war. Yeah, I mean, the same way that, all these people all of a sudden say that Iraq was a mistake, even though they all decided to vote for it at the time. It's the same old song and dance with these people. They'll vote for the war when it's proposed, but then when it turns out to be a unmitigated train wreck, they will pretend like they were against it the whole time. It's hilarious. But he neither centered these platforms nor accompanied them with concrete policy proposals that would actually bring an end to endless war. In keeping with this trajectory, Biden is already drawing from a host of pro-war individuals from the Obama era to fill his cabinet. Because many of these people have been around for a while and have relationships across Washington, there is no shortage of well-known political figures who are testifying to their decency and smarts. That's how the relatively insular world of Washington national security professionals works, after all. But for those on the outside of the Washington blob looking in, the operative questions are: what are these appointees' records, and what does it say about what exactly we are up against in the Biden administration? So, and then, it goes through, it talks about Antony Blinken. He was in favor of the Iraq invasion. He was a hawk on Syria and taking out Assad, which, Obama ultimately decided not to do. He was in favor of the disastrous military intervention in Libya in 2011. And in 2018, he helped launch West Exec Advisors, a strategic advisory firm that is secretive about its clients, along with other Obama administration alumni like Michelle Flournoy, another gem. And Jonathan Geyer, who writes for American Prospect, was quoted as saying, "I learned that Blinken and Flournoy use their networks to build a large client base at the intersection of tech and defense. An Israeli surveillance startup turned to them. So did a major U.S. defense company. Google billionaire Eric Schmidt and Fortune 100 companies went to them too." I mean, they're basically really in bed with intelligence apparatuses and big tech. I mean, that's basically, big tech's fingerprints are all over this administration and all over this cabinet. That's one of the more glaringly obvious things that I've noticed about Biden's appointees so far, is that big tech has such an influence. But other lesser-known Obama administration alumni deserve greater scrutiny. Among them is Avril Haines, who has been tapped as don't even get me started on this witch, who has been tapped as Biden's Director of National Intelligence. Haines was one of the co-authors of Obama's presidential policy guidance, the infamous drone playbook that normalized targeted assassinations around the world. And this is a woman who, when the Senate was investigating black site tortures, brought to you by the great CIA, she was one of the people who hid the info and really covered up the CIA's actions. She also was, heavily involved in covering up the CIA's, or attempting to cover up the CIA's hacking of Senate computers in 2014. It's basically the same situation, but in particular, she also really tried to cover up the existence of black sites that were being used, illegal black sites that were being used by the CIA. So she's really in bed with just a dark part of the intelligence agency's torture programs. I mean, that's why progressives hate her so much. Since becoming the National Security Council's legal advisor in 2011, she had been working on a wide array of highly complicated and legally sensitive issues, generally until 1 or 2 in the morning, sometimes later, that go to the core of U.S. security interest. Among them were the legal requirements governing U.S. intervention in Syria and a range of highly classified options for thwarting Iran's nuclear program. All the while, Haynes was sometimes summoned in the middle of the night to weigh in on whether a suspected terrorist could be lawfully incinerated by a drone strike. During the Biden presidential campaign, there was a concerted effort by former Obama aides to cast Hayes retroactively as a voice of restraint and protecting civilians, as captured in an article by Spencer Ackerman. This revisionism should not be believed. Whatever civilian protections Haynes may have written into drone law, they clearly did not work. And in 2018, Haynes angered progressives when she spoke in support of Gina Haspel, who was a demon in my opinion, and who the left rightfully was totally outraged when Trump nominated her as director of the CIA. Haspel was widely opposed, and Haynes supported her. Haspel was widely opposed for her role in running CIA prisons where torture took place. And then there was Linda Thomas Greenfield, tapped to serve as United Nations ambassador. And he goes into her, and totally a bunch of swamp monster, torture advocates, warmongers, the worst absolute scum when it comes to foreign policy. It's just absolutely insidious at this point. And I correct me if I don't know if I'm wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure that Avril Haines has significant defense contractor ties. I know for a fact that multiple other Biden choices in terms of foreign policy have incredible ties to defense contractors. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon. Michelle Flournoy is one of she was considered the favorite at one point to lead the Pentagon, and all these choices, they're all involved in like the hawkish center-left think tank, like the Center for New American Security, and they get funding from corporations like Raytheon, which has really been supplying the genocide in Yemen. It's unbelievable, and it's not getting any coverage by the corporate media because the corporate media is totally in bed with the military-industrial complex and the rest of the political establishment. And I think it's completely disgusting. And I think this is something that needs to be pointed out a lot more. Biden has come off as more of a dove than a hawk, I guess, in terms of foreign policy. But judging by his actions and what he's filled his cabinets with and his voting history, I don't think we can trust that. I think he knows that foreign interventionism is very unpopular at this juncture, after all the quagmires we've been involved in with the Middle East. But at the end of the day, it's not up to Joe Biden what happens with our foreign policy. It's up to the owners of his administration, and that is the military-industrial complex. They completely own his cabinet, and they decide what goes. And I think that will be very apparent as the Biden presidency unfolds. And so, a little bit of pessimism, but I think it rightfully so. Rightfully so. I think a lot of the optimism about Joe Biden coming into office and all these things, and he's better than Trump, and I think I'm going to be doing a lot more on Joe Biden and the inherent corruption that is being drafted into his administration, because way too many people are looking over this. Way too many people are ignoring it, and I think it's disgusting. I think it's very, and looking at what happened to guys like Glenn Greenwald, who wrote for The Intercept and reported on Hunter Biden, who is under an FBI investigation right now. There's an untold there's an untold rule in journalism that you just don't go after the Biden administration for some reason. It's just off limits. And I really don't understand the attitude behind it. But more on Joe Biden's military-industrial complex cabinet that he's assembled that I think is a threat to peace. This is from People magazine. It's basically a glowing article about Lloyd Austin. How he's the first black defense secretary. It's just unbelievable that the left plays with identity politics to an extent that they can put in a war profiteer as defense secretary, and it can be viewed as a virtuous thing. And I think Glenn Greenwald went into this very well, where he basically talks about how the left uses identity politics to cover up their own corruption. I think it's a lot easier for progressives to accept war criminals in an administration if they're brown, if they're trans or gay. And this is great. I mean, I'm all for more diversity, but can we pull from a better group of people? I mean, it's unbelievable what levels of identity politics that they will that they will reach to cover up the insidious agenda that they're pushing for. It's like Glenn Greenwald, he tweeted, General Lloyd Austin on the Raytheon board is yet another high-level Biden nominee enmeshed in D.C.'s corporatist revolving door of legalized influence peddling. If confirmed, Raytheon will have a very good friend in charge of the bloated $750 billion annual U.S. defense budget. So he sits on the board of a company that makes money off of building weapons and selling weapons to foreign countries, including Yemen. Selling, not Yemen, excuse me, Saudi Arabia. Selling weaponry to Saudi Arabia to bomb Yemen is a conflict of interest if you're in the Defense Department. It's a huge conflict of interest. It can influence U.S. policy easily. And it's totally legal. There's no law against it. It's unbelievable. And, there's the whole argument about, Biden's choice for Pentagon. Sorry, the article's blanking out here. Biden's choice for Pentagon chief further erodes a key U.S. norm, civilian control. The choice of General Austin further erodes the once sacred American norm that military officials will be barred from exercising control over the Pentagon until substantial time has passed after leaving active duty military service. Before General Austin can be confirmed, Biden will need a special waiver from Congress under the National Security Act of 1947. That law, a cornerstone, can't pronunciate today, of the post-World War II national security state provides that a person who has within 10 years been on active duty as a commissioned officer and a regular component of the armed services shall not be eligible for appointment as Secretary of Defense. And it just completely erodes that norm. Not only that, I think he was involved in WestX exec advisors too. So just a total circle of corruption with everybody involved. It's peddling influence. It's the military-industrial complex taking over. Raytheon, which he's a board member of, is the world's third largest defense contractor. That means that upon Austin's confirmation, Raytheon will have a very good friend in charge of the bloated $750 billion annual U.S. defense budget. If ethical considerations were not determinative, that leaves the question of why Biden risked a confirmation battle over military control of the Pentagon by rejecting Flournoy in favor of General Austin. According to Politico, race was a major factor. Biden had been undergoing pressure to nominate a black person to be his defense secretary in recent weeks. The site had previously reported that members of the Congressional Black Caucus are urging Biden to pick a black defense secretary, somewhat dimming hopes that Biden will pick Flournoy. So don't pick who is best qualified for the job. Let's play identity politics to pretend that we're diverse and pretend that we're virtuous and to virtue signal to the progressives, even though we're putting in a bunch of war hawks and war profiteers. Let's, play patty. Let's play hooky with the progressives and, make it look like we're throwing them a bone. It's unfreaking believable. So that's the show. That's the dry run. And I'll see you later.